Could we have the scripture up, please? Lance wrote the first prayer of the people. And I noticed that he wrote that we should pray for those who are in the greatest need. And so I guess that's why I'm leading off this series. Honestly, I did not sleep last night. And my concern is that my concern now and my concern then was that the stories that I would tell you of children whom I've encountered would be so disturbing to children who are in our midst, that I really could not tell it. And then it occurred to me the irony of being concerned about disturbing children in this congregation with the disturbing nature of the children whom I've encountered over so many years. I'm a child of this church. I first came into this church in my mother's arms when I was an infant, and now I'm 2 months short of 70 years of age. As my wife tells me, I've come a long way not to get very far. We do have 3 children and 4 grandchildren. Our youngest grandchildren, Harrison, is now only about 4 months old. And as I think about that, I think that he's only going to be 82 years of age in the year 2100. Wow. Imagine. My father, who's a member of this church and is 99 years of age, was born in 1919. He still lives by himself. He still drives a car. He still plays golf. He even has a girlfriend. But imagine how much the life has changed for individual people since he was born. He was born on a farm. He plowed with horses when he was a kid. He went into the Army Air Corps and made his living as a pilot. The first plane that he flew as a trainer was an open cockpit biplane. And the last plane that he flew was a DC-8, which was a 250-seat jumbo jet, the first jumbo jet. How much life has changed in just 99 years. As I said, I'm almost 70. How much life has changed, day-to-day life, even since I was born. When I was born, we had a TV about that large. It was black and white. There were only 3 channels. I don't think penicillin had yet been invented. There was no polio vaccine. How much has changed just in my 70 years in transportation, in communications, in healthcare, in all of our individual activities. It used to be when I was a child, I would go to the bookmobile. Anybody here remember that? And I would go and get books, and I would read those books, select them very carefully because you could only get 3. And I would spend my time in the summers out of school either by reading those books or by going outside and playing baseball with my friends in the neighborhood. Now, there was a great deal of silence. There was a great deal of time that I spent by myself. And now our children are glued to cell phones and to internet and to Snapchat and to Instagram and into other things that were probably invented last week that I don't know about. Who knows how life is going to change in the next 82 years when our grandson Harrison will probably live that long, given medical science, God willing. How much will life change? How much will your children change? How much will life change for your children? So we need to think about, as I know you all are, what our children need to have to equip them to deal with whatever that change is going to be. My career has been spent in addition with my children, and I want to add that there are some people here who know my children and particularly know our daughter who played soccer at Stanford and is a heart surgeon now. And I tell people that from her mother, she got her intelligence, and from my dad, she got her athletic ability, and from me, she got her tuition. So I claim to know something about children from our own family. But I also know about children perhaps that some of you have not known. I was in the United States Attorney's Office in Washington, D.C. for 5 years. I am not only an ordained minister, but I've been a licensed attorney for 42 years. And for a year of that, I was on the street teamed with 2 homicide detectives, making cases against violent people who were on probation or parole in the ghetto, in the houses of people. And I saw there the lives of children that were essentially wasted. The turning point in my life was when I was out, and some of you have heard this story, but it's like my road to Damascus. I was out with 2 homicide detectives, and we were looking for a witness to put in the grand jury for a homicide case. It was 1 o'clock in the morning, and we got a call to a murder, to a shooting, a live shooting at a tenement house. We were the first law enforcement people to arrive there. Joe and JT dived into that house. It was a brownstone house that had once been 3 stories, owned by one family. Some enterprising slumlord had turned it into a kind of an apartment building where there was a quote-unquote family unit in every room. And all we knew was that somebody had been shot in that building at 1 o'clock in the morning. All the lights were on, lit up like a Christmas tree when we went in, but we didn't know what we'd find. When we went in the house, all we saw was angry, hate-filled faces at these 3 people, 3 men from law enforcement. All of us were Anglo when we came in. Not that we were their saviors, we were there to help, but real anger. And in every room, we saw small children and teenagers. The teenagers looked at us with the same kind of anger and hatred. We finally found the scene of the shooting, which was on the second floor. And a man, there were too much poverty, too much drugs, too much alcohol, too much frustration, too much unemployment, had gotten angry and had shot a woman and had then shot himself. And as we went into the room, this beautiful 12-year-old African-American girl opened the door without even change of expression on her face. And we went in and saw the scene. There was a 3-year-old boy crying so hard he wasn't making a sound, with tears pouring down out of his eyes and snot running off his mouth. What chance did that little boy have? I've thought about that little boy so many times over the years. I ended up being a felony prosecutor and then deputy chief of felony trial. I was in charge of all the murder prosecutions in D.C. I tried 8 first-degree murder cases to jury verdict as a prosecutor, and I was in charge of all the prosecutions against crimes against children. And those children victims, were invariably poor from the ghetto. The only positive voices, the only hopeful voices that I heard, because that 3-year-old boy grew up. And the likelihood was that he turned to that same kind, that he lived in a life of violence, that he lived a life of unemployment, he lived a life of cynicism, he lived a life of self-loathing. And so he turned to violence himself. And at the end of that treadmill of children of poverty into youth and young adults of poverty stood a person like me to put him in prison until he lost the urge to commit crimes. It was not a hopeful solution. It was no solution at all. The only hopeful voices that I heard coming out of the inner city were from those African American churches. I was in all those homes and saw all those children. And years later, after Maxine and I had come back here from D.C. to my home, she is an attorney as well and just retired as a law professor at Texas A&M. And I'd made enough money to take care of us for the rest of our lives. We had made enough money. I started dreaming about that 3-year-old. I'm sorry. And in my dream, he would take me by the hand and he would lead me throughout that building to the other children who were there. And so, with the support of my amazing wife, and some of you here know her and I can affirm that, I went into ministry and took an inner city church at Diamond Hill, which is one of the poorest parts of the city. At that time, it was 85% Hispanic, and maybe 75% of those were undocumented, and there was real poverty in that neighborhood. And I was in those homes, and I saw children of poverty who really came from very tight family units. And then, 13 years ago, I combined legal and ordained ministry with the Methodist Justice Ministry, which is a ministry of this church. And as many of you know, we provide free legal assistance to victims of family violence, but mostly of child abuse and neglect. We only help people whose incomes are at 125% of federal poverty guidelines. And some of my board members are here today. Stand up. Courtney, stand up. Jim, stand up. These are people who've supported me and supported this ministry.
Amen.
And I have at least one employee of the Methodist Justice Ministry and one former employee who was my right hand for 10 years until she quit me. Would you guys please stand up? Please stand up. We get 20 to 25 new requests for help every week. In the past 2 weeks, we've received 8 referrals of child sexual abuse cases from Alliance for Children. We deal with people who are seeking legal custody of children of poverty because their parents are not able to care for them. And most often, they can't care for them, they don't care for them because they were children of poverty. Now, the reason I chose, the scripture's not up there, but there was 2 scriptures. There it is. Okay, there's one scripture that describes the man in need in the famous parable of the prodigal son. And the reason why I included that there was that this was a man in need because it was his own fault. It was his own fault. He treated his father disrespectfully. He treated his father as if he were dead, and demanded the property that would befall to the son when the father died, as if he was already died. And he not only did that, but he abandoned him and went to another place, another country, and lived dissolutely and wasted all of his money. And then he was in danger of starvation. He was in great need. Jesus makes that point in that parable that regardless of whether we are responsible for our own suffering, for our own plight, to a Christian, there is still the calling of mercy. There is still the calling of mercy. We tend to excuse our indifference to people in need because they are, we think, responsible for their own plight. And one of the points of that parable is it doesn't matter. The Christian is called to be merciful, whether the person is responsible for their own plight or not. But then we have, and I've lost my sound guy, the second description of the, oh, no, I haven't. There was another man in need in the other famous parable of Jesus, the parable of the prodigal son. And there, Jesus describes a man who was not at fault at all for his own plight. In fact, Jesus, in the genius of this parable, doesn't even tell us anything about him, just that he was set upon and beaten and left lying on the side of the road. Brothers and sisters, the children of poverty are lying by the side of the road, and it's not their fault. They are powerless to save themselves. And the parents of those children, we could say, if we stretch it, and I don't believe this, but we can say that they are responsible for their own plight and for the plight of their children. I do not believe that for the most part because of the lives that they were stuck with when they were children. But even if they are responsible for their own plight, as Christians, we are called to be merciful to them as well. Now, what is it like to be a child of poverty? The chances are much likely, if you're born into extreme poverty, that your one parent is absent and perhaps both. It's much more likely that one of those parents or both of the parents will be addicted to drugs, like methamphetamine or cocaine or heroin or alcohol. You will be under stress constantly from the youngest age, often being passed around from family member to family member and even to friend. Your family will be facing eviction constantly. There'll be constant and intermittent unemployment, and there will be absent parents because they're working or because they're just absent, because your father is unknown, you don't know who the father is, and your mother doesn't know who the father is. There is a much greater likelihood than with other children that one of your parents or both will suffer from untreated mental illness, from major depressive disorder or bipolar, even schizophrenia. Your life will be a matter of stress, one stress after another. And most of all, and I would add, that in the United States, 30% of all people who work full-time work a second job, have to work a second job. That's weighted very strongly toward low-income families. And what that means is that your parents aren't there, or your parent, the caregiver, is not there. And we see in case after case after case in which children are raising children. Studies are now showing that that part of the human brain that supports judgment, good judgment, and joy do not develop normally in children of poverty because of all of this stress. And I have seen and experienced with my own eyes that these children lack self-esteem, and they have a cynicism about themselves and a lack of energy, not just because their diet is so bad. They don't have parents or caregivers who value education because it never got them anywhere. And they are forgotten. There are, according to the latest statistics, 1 in 6 children in the United States who are in extreme poverty. I don't know why the churches aren't talking about this every Sunday. 1 in 6 children in the United States, in this country, are in extreme poverty. It's a friend of mine, good guy. In Tarrant County, 26% of the children live in neighborhoods of extreme poverty. 26% of the children in this county live in neighborhoods of extreme poverty. And a neighborhood of extreme poverty is defined by the median individual income is below federal poverty guidelines. And I can tell you, because our clients are at 125% of federal poverty guidelines or lower, that is real poverty. That is real poverty. Just because you're over the FPL doesn't mean that you're not in poverty. And these children are trapped there, and it affects everything about their present, and it affects everything about their future. We at the Methodist Justice Ministry generally take in cases referred to us by CPS, and I just saw 2 CPS workers come in. I want you to stand up. Samantha Arakovich and Teresa Moreno. They are such good friends of ours. We take cases when people told me I didn't need this anyway. Thank you for your patience. We take cases in which parents are unable or fail to provide for their children because of mental illness, drug addiction, family violence in the home, and I failed to mention that a child of poverty is much more likely to see family violence repeatedly and chronically in the home than children who are not in that situation. We take cases in which CPS has placed those children with a family member, like a grandfather or a grandmother, an aunt or an uncle, a sibling, sometimes just friends, who will take the child or children in order to provide for them and nurture them and protect them, although they are poor, or we wouldn't take the case. On Friday, I sat down and did a survey of our active cases. We have 2 lawyers, including myself. We have 56 active cases of the type that I just described. Of the 56 cases, 38 involve parents who are addicted to methamphetamine. 6 cases, and this is low for us, this is just a snapshot I took of the cases that we have. 6 involve a child who was born addicted to drugs because the mother used methamphetamine or heroin or cocaine while they were pregnant. And before we are ready to throw them under the bus, so to speak, imagine the self-contempt that a mother would have for herself if she could not avoid using drugs when she was pregnant. 30 of the 56 cases involve one or both parents diagnosed with mental illness but untreated. 48 of our 56 active cases now involve violence in the child's home in which the child was either a victim or had witnessed it. And I can tell you, and Samantha and Teresa can tell you, that in case after case after case, we have an older child who takes her younger siblings or his younger siblings into a bedroom and locks the door while the mother and her boyfriend or the father and mother are fighting, and I mean fighting. Imagine the impact upon a child of being the best caregiver for his or her own siblings. 45 of the 56 cases involve a child diagnosed with mental illness, major depressive disorder, occupational defiance disorder, or even, consider this, post-traumatic stress disorder in a child. 33 of the cases of the 56 cases that we have now, and this is just a snapshot, involve all of these: drug addiction by the parent, violence in the home, mental illness, and one illness. So many of us want to walk by. And we live in a culture, in a community in which the poor are basically separated from us in different neighborhoods. How much of our time do we spend trying to insulate ourselves from poverty and from people of poverty? How many children of poverty are in your child's school or daycare? And when a child of poverty gets into that public school, maybe even gets into a private school very rarely, but mostly in public schools, and that child begins to act out what's happened to the child. Act out that child has been taught that its life has no value. And so when the child gets older, that no one's life has any value. A child that acts out in a way that the child doesn't even understand. How many of us want to complain and get that child out of the classroom with our own children, out of the school of our own children? The truth is, and it just strikes me as this, the situation of the parable of the Good Samaritan would be extremely rare, wouldn't it? Because we don't pass by the children of poverty. They're somewhere else. Now, what can we do about this? We're all Methodists, so I have to give a go ye sermon. Go ye and do this. The truth is, I can see on your faces that a number of you, and particularly the young women here, are going to feel stricken by this if you weren't aware of the extent of it, or perhaps you were. I'm giving myself too much credit. And you're going to feel uneasy about it, and you're going to think that you want to go out and do something. And that's wonderful. In fact, one thing you could do is contribute to the Methodist Justice Ministry, because I have to raise the money. We get to raise the money for that program. It's not really funded by this church. But I want to talk to you for the time that I have left about the things that I've concluded over all these years of dealing with my own children and with the children of the poor about what children need and the role of the church in that. And I think there are 4 things that are needed for not only them, but for all of our children, and particularly to deal with the stress of the changes, the unexpected and unpredictable changes that are going to occur in the rest of the century. The first need of every child, obviously, is family. That is the first and the last need. That is the unit that is the basis of all welfare, of all goodness in a community. And part of what the CPS workers do and part of what the Methodist Justice Ministry does is to try to create a family, a new family for these children, so that they're going to be nurtured and protected, and that the people who will do that have the parental rights to make those decisions. The second thing that all children need, but particularly the children of poverty, is a wider community to be a part of. Now think about that for a second. A community, a wider community that welcomes you, in which you have a place. And there's places there for you to achieve, in which you're going to be welcomed and valued. And that the children of the poor don't have. Because they see the advertisements, they see the television shows, they see the movies, they see the Mercedes SUVs being driven around in a county in which 1/4 of the children are food insecure. They see that. They know that they're not accepted. They know that they're feared. They know that they don't have a significant chance to find a place in that community. They see their parents working minimum wage jobs and working 2 jobs, or their grandparents or whoever the caregiver is, and not being able to make a place. If they're black or they're brown, they deal with that. That is a reality. And so when there is no such community beckoning them, what community do they seek? They seek drugs as an escape. They seek sexual hookups for the pleasure of it. And for the young women, awfully teenage girls, they're looking for this being, this child, this human being to love them and give them warmth. And they're looking to be able to attract a man who will stay with them because she's pregnant or has their child. The people, the children of the poor, and all children need a community in which they're going to be welcomed and in which they're going to fit. And what could be more faithful to the gospel of Jesus Christ than that all of our communities should be open to everyone, and that everyone should be valued and cherished and protected as a child of God. The third need is for meaningful goals, meaningful and achievable goals for a purpose in life that is satisfying, that is meaningful, and that is positive. Now, I have a book coming out on this at the end of the year, and this is heavy, this is negative, this is prophetic. But in this culture, I believe that the loudest voices are saying that the only source of meaning and honor and satisfaction is the acquisition of more and more things and the experiencing of more and more transient pleasures. This is not a community at all, say these voices. It's a competition. And so the man on the side of the road in the parable of the Good Samaritan and the children of poverty are simply losers in the competition. They have simply lost. I was talking to a man just this morning who was telling me that all people basically start on the side of the road, and then they just have to build themselves up to where he is, which is as an architect. And I told him, you have no idea. You're never on the side of the road like the children of poverty are. Ever. And so the children of the poor absorb this narrative, this primary story, that the only way to be successful, to be anybody, to be happy, is to achieve and acquire more and more stuff and more pleasure. And they try to get that stuff And they try to experience that pleasure any way they can. They don't have the means that my children did. They don't have the means that other children do. And so that leads to the pleasure of drugs. And that leads to the pleasure of these promiscuous sexual hookups. That leads to all the pregnancy and abandoning children. That leads, frankly, to crime. Methamphetamine is the plague of drugs in this county and in this state. And the nature of methamphetamine is that it's like a hallucinogen. It's not so physically addictive as it is psychologically and emotionally addictive. A person who takes methamphetamine is transported into another world in which they are all powerful. It's an escape. We all need to learn, our own children need to learn, that just acquisition of more and more stuff and more transient pleasures feeds our bellies, so to speak, but not our souls. That the goals and purposes of life that feed us, that strengthen our souls, that lead to a truly satisfying life, are the virtues that were taught by Jesus of sacrifice and love and fostering community, family, hard work. Those are the sources of all happiness, not stuff and not things, and not treating the poor as if they just lost the competition and blaming them, but particularly not children of the poor. And the fourth thing that we all need, and this is the hardest thing for me to articulate, but something that I'm convinced is more and more true every day I live. The children of the poor need not only to be equipped with the inner strength, the inner regard, the inner self-respect to weather the storms that they have to weather, but they have to learn that what is inside them is the true source of all happiness. That virtue, that character, that spark of the divine that is in us all. And all of our children need to learn this, that happiness doesn't come from the stuff, the internet, the Instagram, the hookups, the cars, the vacation. That's not truly the source of happiness and satisfaction, that the source lies within us. That within us, in the quiet, is that image of God, and that in that is the source of all happiness. That means we have to tell our children no when they want stuff. That means that we can't just hover over them and help them do everything. They need to learn to do things for themselves and develop their own character and their own strength. But nowhere is that more important than with the children of the poor. They need family. They need a community that will welcome them and forgive them and nurture them. They need purposes in life that are satisfying and achievable. And they need to learn that the source of all happiness, that the source of a truly human life is within themselves and not within something they can acquire. All right. That's all right. That's all right. What could be more in tune with the teachings of Christ? How many times did Jesus tell us in his teachings in his life that happiness doesn't come from the acquisition of more and more stuff? That happiness and satisfaction and joy comes from service and from love and from nurture. I'll leave you with this. When I was growing up, and here I'm being one of those old coots, when I was growing up, I think there was a hierarchy of virtue. I think there was a hierarchy of virtue. People were judged by how hardworking they were, how honest they were, how much they were supportive of the community, how much they took care of their neighbors. Now, in this lost culture, it's become a hierarchy of stuff and of pleasure, and virtue means nothing. Success and acquisition of power and of getting that stuff is all that matters. This culture cannot stand against the will of God in that way, and our children, not just children of the poor, but our own children, cannot thrive and live truly human lives and have the character withstand the changes that are to come based upon a life that is so directed to shallow things outside of themselves. And the prophet Isaiah said, "Why do you run after food that does not satisfy? Why do you seek drink that does not fill?" What the church needs to do is be the church. What the church needs to do is forever and repeatedly proclaim these values given to us by our Lord, these values that feed our souls and not just our bellies. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen.